The funeral is about to begin, sir.
Welcome to Deconstructing, sir, where we take apart an iconic horror movie to find out what makes it tick. Is it just a dream? Well, at least in the mind of its creator, that's how it all started. But one thing we know for sure, this surreal coming-of-age nightmare is one of the most memorable horror movies of all time. Written, directed, photographed, and edited by Don Coscarelli, independently financed with a crew comprised mostly of friends and family, this cult classic remains his most personal and beloved feature. A surreal meditation on death, loss, and adolescent fears that still resonates with audiences over 4 decades later. Since becoming a runaway hit after its release in 1979, we've seen this film evolve into a long-running franchise, with Coscarelli directing 3 more sequels and scripting the final chapter in the series. The original also received an amazing 4K remaster, financed by none other than Hollywood hitmaker J.J. Abrams. I can't think of a more perfect film for our Deconstructing series, in which I approach classic horror titles in 3 stages. Origin, where we trace the film's evolution from that first spark of an idea to the final cinematic form. Legacy, as we look at the film's box office success, its expanding cinematic universe, and its impact on popular culture. And finally, in Mystery, I explore some lesser-known facts about the film, along with insider tales from its production, rumors, and trivia that might surprise you. So lie back, get comfy, and prepare to have a ball as we enter the nightmare dimension that is Don Coscarelli's original classic, Phantasm. Although he was only 25 years old when he began mapping out the script for Phantasm, Don Coscarelli was already an experienced director with 2 feature films for major studios on his resume. But after disappointing box office numbers for his 1976 slice-of-life comedy Kenny and Company, he wanted to find something more commercial for his next project, and he knew that a horror film could bring in decent returns on a low budget. He used one of his own childhood nightmares as a springboard for the story, a dream in which he was chased through a labyrinth of marble corridors by a metal sphere armed with a giant needle, which would suck his brains out if it caught him. The film's title comes from a term often used in the works of Edgar Allan Poe, who used it to describe a ghost, vision, or hallucination. It had this strange gothic creepiness to it that fit the concept that was now swirling around in Coscarelli's imagination.
Oh shit.
He spent time in a secluded cabin to flesh out the story, and spontaneous images began to emerge, like the idea for a severed finger moving around in a box, which came to him after poking his finger through the bottom of a styrofoam coffee cup. Both of Don's previous projects, Kenny and Company and his debut feature, Jim the World's Greatest, were told from the perspective of adolescent boys, and he tapped into that same vibe for Phantasm, where 13-year-old Mike confronts feelings of death, abandonment, and an unknown future through a series of nightmare encounters that may or may not be real. Mike's concept of death is embodied by a villain who would eventually become one of the most iconic boogeymen in horror history, the Tall Man.
I've been waiting for you.
That role went to imposing actor Rory Guy, who had previously co-starred under the stage name Angus Scrimm. The name had a cool gothic ring to it, making it ideal for a horror actor, and it would soon be on the lips of horror fans around the world. In real life, Grimm stood about 6'4", so he was legit a tall man, but Coscarelli wanted him to be even more imposing. To achieve this, the costume department, which was actually Don's mother, fitted him with suits a couple sizes too small and shoes with lifts to boost him even higher. When that still wasn't enough, he stood on a box. Many of the tall man's creepy mannerisms came from the actor himself, who had experience playing strange and eccentric characters on stage. To accentuate his skeletal appearance and sinister sneer, Scrimm gave him a more sadistic personality. The tall man is clearly having fun tormenting Mike like a cat playing with a mouse.
Boy!
Since we're going to stick mainly to the first film, I won't dig much deeper into the canon when it comes to the interdimensional origins of the Tall Man and his mutant minions, because when Coscarelli was writing the script, he didn't intend to explain it in detail. That's part of what scared audiences back in '79. All the bizarre goings-on are totally random, just like they would be in a real nightmare.
What the hell is going on?
Coscarelli's original cut of Phantasm was nearly 3 hours, but the director knew he couldn't release a film that long, so he started cutting. The elements from many of these cut scenes had been considered lost by the time the final cut went to theaters, but they would eventually resurface, and I'll get to that in our mystery section. Before the film hit theaters, though, there was one more cut needed. The ratings board objected to the pool of urine coming from the dead henchman's bladder after he's killed by the sphere. It's hard to believe that shot would have earned the film an X rating, but thankfully the board changed their minds after noted film critic Charles Champlin came to the film's defense. Champlin's stamp of approval basically told them Phantasm was more than just cheap exploitation. Embassy Pictures released Phantasm in the spring of 1979, and the box office numbers were impressive to say the least. The film raked in $12 million during its initial run. Not too bad for a DIY indie flick with a budget of around $300,000. Audiences around the world showed up in droves, and Coscarelli had a hit on his hands. Surprisingly, there wasn't much call for a sequel at first, but the film's success did take Coscarelli's career to the next level. His reputation got another boost with the 1982 release of The Beastmaster, which rode the wave of popular sword and sorcery epics like Conan the Barbarian. It also seemed to be in constant rotation on cable TV, which led to the joke that HBO actually stands for, "Hey, Beastmaster's on." In the meantime, Phantasm became a hit on home video and one of the most rented horror titles of the 80s. Finally, Universal decided to back a long-awaited Phantasm sequel, this time with a relatively large budget. While 1988's Phantasm 2 is an impressive addition to the Phantasm universe, there was still something missing. Universal apparently didn't think Michael Baldwin had the screen presence to reprise his role as Mike. As a result, Coscarelli had to recast the part, which ended up going to James LeGros, whom you may remember from Point Break or any number of 90s indie flicks. There's another interesting bit of casting trivia there, but we'll get back to that.
It's only a dream.
It's a dream.
No, it's not.
Still, Reggie Bannister does return as Reggie the Ice Cream Man, securing his title as the franchise's wisecracking anti-hero, much like Bruce Campbell's Ash in the Evil Dead series. His character would become more prominent in all of the sequels and lies at the emotional core of the final chapter, Phantasm Ravager, which revisits the original film's themes of mortality, loss, and existential horror. I've been a major fan of this movie all my life, but every time I watch it, I always get something new out of it, and I'd like to share some of my favorite discoveries with you in our infamous mystery section. Phantasm packs a lot of weirdness into its 89-minute runtime, but as I mentioned earlier, the initial cut that Coscarelli screened for test audiences was over twice that long. He knew he couldn't release a 3-hour movie, so he set about chopping it down to size.
You think you'll go to heaven? You go to us.
Most of what he cut was character development and further drama between brothers Mike and Jody, but he also cut and rearranged several key scenes, removed a ton of plot exposition, and cut an alternate death scene for the tall man. A lot of this footage can be seen on various Blu-ray, DVD, and Laserdisc editions, but for years most of the elements from the original cut were believed to be lost. In the late 90s, some of the negative resurfaced, and several cut scenes were incorporated into 1998's Phantasm 4 Oblivion as flashbacks. Coscarelli recently revealed that he does have the complete original cut in some form, and he's considering releasing it in the near future. Remember how Universal pressured Coscarelli to recast the role of Mike for Phantasm 2? Well, before he chose James LeGros for the role, there were other names on the shortlist, one of which was an up-and-coming star with the name of Brad Pitt. Pitt had a fair amount of acting experience by then, but he didn't quite make the cut. It would have been interesting, though, to see Pitt in that role, but since I was hoping to see Michael Baldwin reprise the role, I doubt I would have cared one way or the other. Anyway, Pitt landed a horror movie gig immediately after that with a lead role in the 1989 slasher Cutting Class. Phantasm is basically a coming-of-age story told through the vivid nightmares of a teenage boy, but it might have been a much different variation on that theme if the stars had lined up a bit differently. While shooting Kenny and Company, Coscarelli considered adapting Ray Bradbury's classic novella, Something Wicked This Way Comes. Unfortunately, the rights had just gone to Disney, although their film adaptation wouldn't hit screens until 1983. I like to think Phantasm is basically the same story, but in a groovy 70s setting. One point of contention among fans of both Phantasm and Star Wars is which filmmaker was the first to conceive the pint-sized, brown-robed creatures seen in both franchises. That's kind of a fuzzy area. Star Wars was still in production when Coscarelli was writing Phantasm, and he almost had their robes dyed gray instead of brown before deciding to stick with what he had. There's another weird conjunction around the same time that you might not know about. Rocker Neil Young's 1978 tour featured very similar creatures scurrying around the stage. Nicknamed Road Eyes, they're actually Neil Young's road crew working with oversized props to make them look smaller. I suspect this concept really was lifted from Star Wars, and George Lucas wasn't too pleased. The Road Eyes were dropped from the stage show, but you can still see them in the concert film Rust Never Sleeps, which, as it turned out, hit theaters the same year as Phantasm. As a huge fan of movie novelizations from the 70s and 80s, this is one of my favorite Phantasm facts. Don's mother, Kate Coscarelli, who took on multiple duties on the film, including makeup and costume design, also happens to be a published author who adapted and expanded her son's screenplay into a novel. It didn't actually get published in the United States, but in Japan, where Michael Baldwin had become a teen heartthrob thanks to Kenny and Company, a Japanese translation of the book went into brief circulation in 1980 before it finally vanished into obscurity. Thankfully, the complete novel was given an official English-language release in 2002, but only in a short run of 500 signed copies. As you might imagine, these have become the holy grail among hardcore Phantasm fans. I really love revisiting the history and minutiae of Phantasm, which remains one of my all-time favorite films. If you dig it as much as I do, I hope this episode makes you fall in love with it all over again. Thanks for tuning in.
We're hot as love, you know.